Alright, let's get started with our first Hibernate example. And for this purpose, as I've already mentioned, we're going to be using Maven as a project management tool, and so I'm going to create the project using the same. If you don't know Maven, then just try to imitate exactly what I'm doing. Click on File, New, and then Maven Project. Click Next. In my Maven course, I've explained everything about all these prompts. So I'm going to click Next. I'm currently using the default archetype, which is Maven Archetype Quick Start. Here we can give any coordinates of our choice, but I would recommend you to give the same coordinates that I'm about to give. That's because I actually have ready-made files that I'm going to add into our project, and these files are actually tuned according to the naming conventions that I follow here. So in here I'm going to say com.company, and artifact ID is going to be hb-project or proj, just proj. You can give any name of your choice. You have to take care of making those changes in your pom.xml file. If you don't want to take that burden, just give exact same name. Click Finish. So this is going to take a while, and while it does, I'm actually going to walk you through list of steps involved to write our first Hibernate application. You can open this file with the name firstprogsteps.docs, within which I mentioned all these steps that will help you write your first Hibernate application. So the first step in it is, of course, you need to have a database set up. Whichever the database that you're using, you need to have at least one database created. In my case, I'm using PostgreSQL and its default database, which is Postgres. So let me just log into the Postgres shell, and I'm going to enter all the parameters like the server, database, port number. No matter which database you use, it must be having some kind of a command processing tool like this, and you're supposed to log in and enter your database. So I'm going to enter the username and password for the database with the name Postgres, which is the default database in PostgreSQL. So I've logged in successfully. Now I can actually go ahead and create a table. However, I would like to leave that job to Hibernate, so I'm not going to manually create a table. The second step is to create so-called a persistent class, or sometimes termed as an entity class. This is the class whose instances would get stored into the database by Hibernate. Remember this diagram that we had talked in one of our previous examples? So here we have a Java object with certain values assigned to these fields, and Hibernate is actually going to take care of storing all these values in its corresponding table in the relational database. This particular object must have been an instance of this so-called a persistent class. So how do you term a class as a persistent class? Is when that class follows all these rules. Now these are not hard and fast rules. You can break these rules if you wish, if you think it makes sense to do so. But these are the standard rules of a POJO, or plain old Java object. So it must not have any public fields. All the fields must be private, and all the fields would have public getters or setters, and that class would have one default constructor, and that particular class should not extend any other class that has some fancy methods, and that's actually quite obvious. We want to keep things simple. It's just plain old Java object, and the class must not extend or implement any specialized classes or interfaces that has fancy methods with some fancy logic. And optionally, that particular class can be serializable. It's highly recommended that you make it serializable, because more often in distributed applications, these frameworks would actually use the mechanism of serialization to convert the objects into byte stream, store them in memory, and then retrieve back as objects. It has a very significant role, especially in distributed applications, and it's highly recommended that you implement serializable interface for your class. So let's try to execute this particular step. I have got everything ready for you. Go to the list of downloaded files from this course, and you must be able to locate this particular folder with the name First Hibernate Example, inside which you can locate all these files. You see this file with the name employee.java. This is what our persistent class would be. So let's see if our project is ready in our Eclipse environment. It is. I'm going to expand this, and inside our source directory under src main java we have one default class. We can get rid of it if you wish, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply drag this class file into this particular package and make sure that we don't have any errors. As you can see, this is a Pojo. It implements serializable. We have one default constructor. Along with that, we also have a parameterized constructor which we're going to use to assign values to all these fields. We'll take a look at it in a while. And then we have set of fields that we want to correspond them with the relational database table fields, and then we have their corresponding getters and setters. If you're trying to create this class on your own, don't try to write all these getters and setters on your own. It's always better that to generate the code automatically to make it error-free. So you go to source and you choose this option, getters and setters. Currently all the fields in here have their own getters and setters, so I got this prompt. Otherwise you would get to select all the fields for which you want to generate getters and setters. So we're good there. Let's move on with our next step. So the next step is to create so-called a Hibernate configuration file, which would essentially help the Hibernate to talk with the database. So this is the file where you would provide all the connection parameters so that Hibernate will know to which database do you want Hibernate to talk to. So if you go to the list of downloadables or the downloaded files, you'll be able to locate this file with the name hibernate.cfg.xml. So let's drag this into the resources folder. So let's create that particular folder under main. Let's create this folder with the name resources, inside which we're going to put our config file. Let's drag this down to here and let's see what's inside it. It's a very simple XML file with all these tags. Hibernate configuration is going to be the ultimate root tag, inside which you would specify this session factory. We're going to talk about session factory in coming videos. And then you have to provide all these connection parameters. If you've worked with database before, you probably know what these parameters are. You would provide the driver details depending on the database that you're using. Since mine is PostgreSQL, I'm pointing to the PostgreSQL driver. And here's the URL to my database, the connection URL. Wherever your database is installed, this is going to be that IP address, and then port in which your database is installed, and then the database. And here we have that database specific username and password, basically credentials. And then we have something new here, which is called SQL dialect. Remember, I've mentioned that Hibernate takes care of translating the HQL or Hibernate query language to a database specific SQL statements. Well, that is possible because of this dialect. So depending on the database that you're using, you have to provide this particular parameter accordingly. For Postgres, this is what I have to provide, but for, say, if you're using Oracle, then that's going to change to this. And if it is for MySQL, then it's going to be this. So just do a quick Google search and then you'll be able to get the Hibernate dialect specific to your database, and you just have to mention it over here. What we have next here is a couple of tags. These are not really mandatory, but it's always good to set these to true so that when we see the output on the console, we can see the list of SQL statements that were executed by Hibernate. So showSQL flag would tell Hibernate whether do we want to see the instructions that it is executing in our database, and format SQL would instruct Hibernate to show those resulting queries in human readable manner. So the query that gets displayed will split up into multiple lines and it would be easier for us to read. So what we have here next is with this property, we're sort of instructing Hibernate to update the database according to the changes that are being introduced in our entity. So when I set this to update, this is what is actually going to create a table in case if that table is not present in the database. If I don't have this property set, then we should be creating that table prior to creating our entities and running our application. We're going to talk about this particular field in coming videos because you need to be aware of certain terms like session and session factory to completely understand various options we can provide in here. So we're going to skip it for now, but for the time being, this is needed. Just keep that in mind. Let's continue from next video just for your psychological satisfaction, and then we'll understand what this mapping means. See you soon.